From the Sky News Centre at 7, the death of a prominent Kremlin critic in southwest London is now being treated as murder. Tests have concluded that Russian exile Nikolai Glushkov was killed by compression to the neck. It's understood he was found hanged at his home in New Malden on Monday. Our correspondent Ian Woods is outside the property. He says the Russian government wanted him to be extradited.
The Russian embassy in London some months ago put out a list of a couple of dozen people that they felt that the British government were harbouring, which they regarded as criminals, and they wanted to be sent back to their country. Mr. Glushkov was number one on that list.
It's not been linked to the Salisbury spy poisoning, which has provoked an even deeper diplomatic row today. Earlier, Boris Johnson said it was overwhelmingly likely the Russian president signed off on the nerve agent attack. Moscow says the comments are shocking and unforgivable. An 18-year-old Iraqi asylum seeker who planted a homemade bomb on a tube train has been found guilty of attempted murder. Ahmed Hassan packed the device with metal shrapnel, but it failed to detonate properly and instead produced a fireball at Parsons Green Station. Hassan claimed he didn't want to hurt anyone, but the jury didn't believe him, and neither does explosives expert Andy Oppenheimer.
Had it detonated fully, it would have killed people. It was also packed with fragmentation materials, shrapnel, and so that was definitely a device intended to injure and to kill.
Hundreds of pharmacists are going to be sent into England's care homes because there are concerns the elderly are over-medicating. Around 180,000 people living in nursing homes will have their medicines checked. Prince Harry's spoken about the UK's shrinking defence budgets during a visit to a military base. It's unusual for him to talk about cuts on an official engagement. And the highlight of the Cheltenham Festival didn't disappoint as Native River held on to win the Gold Cup. He battled with favourite Mike Bite for much of the race before edging ahead towards the finish line. That's the latest. I'm Elizabeth Secker.
They do not believe in any entity called a devil, and they do not believe in God. It is a mistake for you to assume that they do. They're atheists in the strictest sense of the word.
Our sister show Dialects back here at BCFM 93.2 every Tuesday. You can be sure to catch it online at dialectradio.co.uk. This week, how the US military is worried about China and Russia catching up with the space war capability may decide to take out the Russian and Chinese military satellites before they catch up. A little bit like the missile gap back in the 1960s that led to the Cuban Missile Crisis. Also, Irish journalist Finian Cunningham talks about the Russian spy scandal.
I think what's very clear is that it ought to be obvious to everybody that one of the suspects in this case must be the Western intelligence services or other third-party intelligence services, for example, the Ukrainian intelligence service. And the fact that it's the Russians have been, convicted and tried and convicted and made guilty all in the space of 48 hours ought to raise questions in everybody's mind. How can the British state establish all of these facts in that sort of timescale? And they can't really. And to my mind, this fits a pattern of Western intelligence service provocation, which we can discuss at some length if we've got time. But the fact is that in the past, Western intelligence services have engaged in exactly this kind of provocation. So, for example, I'll just make one point. The anthrax, which was circulated inside the United States after the 9/11 attacks, it's very, very clear, and anybody can check this online. The anthrax was all traced back to Fort Detrick in Maryland, which is the US equivalent of Porton Down. So it definitely came from inside the structure, no doubt about it.
Can chemical weapons be traced back in the same way as biological weapons can?
Well, I don't know, and we're all waiting to hear where the things I've been reading suggest that, and of course what the Russians said quite rightly is, well, you send us a sample of what you've discovered and we will cooperate with your investigation, because in fact we're as angry about this as you are. We don't want this sort of thing happening. We didn't write it off, sign it off. We didn't do it. We want to get to the bottom of it. And there are mechanisms for getting to the bottom of it. I mean, in about 2 years ago, there was celebrations in Russia because they got rid of their whole chemical warfare stockpile, and that was, they were given a clean.
Can we trust them?
Well, no, not necessarily. But the point is that was an internationally supervised deal whereby the Russians agreed to get rid of their chemical warfare stockpile, and we agreed to get rid of ours. And as a result of this particular incident, we're now going to get a massive increase in expenditure and infrastructure at Porton Down. And I have to ask the question, and somebody ought to ask it as a parliamentary question or a freedom of information question: the decision to expand Porton Down, which has been pushed forward on the back of this.
It's £48 million is suddenly descending on Porton.
Yes, indeed. And was that all decided since this incident, or was it already in the pipeline before the incident?
See, there's a bit of
and
a
does
problem.
It have something to do with the incident?
Well, I would suggest yes, it does.
I think Sherlock Holmes, you might be right there.
Porton Down is saying nothing really about the origin of this. In fact, what Craig Murray, the former ambassador, is saying, he's contacting the Foreign Office. He says he's now received confirmation from a well-placed Foreign and Commonwealth Office source that Porton Down scientists are not able to identify the nerve agent as being of Russian manufacture and have been resentful of the pressure being placed on them to do so. Porton Down would only sign up to a formulation of a type originally developed by Russia. So that's what... is this a bribe, this £48 million, to get the Porton Down people to play ball?
If we just do a thought experiment for a minute, if this is a Western intelligence service come on, which I suspect it may be, now there's a possibility that a group like the Ukrainians may have their fingers. Don't forget, they used to be part of the Soviet Union as well. And of course, Craig Murray used to be British ambassador to Uzbekistan, and that was where the equivalent of Porton Down in the Soviet Union was located. And it was all dismantled during the Yeltsin era by Western scientists from the US and elsewhere, and they took away everything that was there. So, if what the British have got to do if they want to make this stick is they've got to make whatever they found available to others to try and ascertain where it came from.
It's already sticking, and it's stuck really because Trump and Macron and the EU effectively have all come in on Britain's side. They're saying you're absolutely right, expel those diplomats.
Yes, and so have some of right-wing Labour MPs, but I'd say none of them have any evidence to prove it one way or the other. All we've got is the word of the British government and the word of the British intelligence services, who've got a track record going back to the 1940s of behaving in a provocative fashion. And as I just mentioned, just as for instance, the Anthrax attacks in the US, which killed 6 people after 9/11, definitely came from Fort Detrick, definitely came from inside the structure. No one inside the structure was ever punished. Therefore, we can presume they carry on doing the same sorts of things.
This novichok weapon, apparently, is it likely to have actually been at Porton Down, which is only 10 minutes drive away from...
The Russians...
Martin, let me finish the sentence. Which is only 10 minutes drive away from Salisbury. Is novichok likely to have been at Porton Down?
Well, what the Russians are saying is the only way they could have ascertained that it was novichok is if they've got samples of their own to compare it against. And, of course, the Russian chemical warfare capability was comprehensively dismantled during the Yeltsin era, and virtually all of it was brought back to the West. And as I've just pointed out, the Russians agreed to dismantle their chemical warfare stuff. It was all dismantled according to international...
it's been destroyed, the chemical weapons from Russia.
Yeah, but, of course, ours hasn't been. Porton Down hasn't been dismantled, has it?
And neither has the United States. The programme of destruction of US chemical weapons has still 5 years to run.
Yes, well, the Russians got ahead of the game and got rid of them all. Because the point is, for the Russians, that what they've been concentrating on is developing fourth-generation nuclear weapons. The stuff that really matters.
So, in other words, because chemical weapons maybe can't be used to take out military targets, they're much more dangerous to civilians?
No, I think
anything to do with it? Because the Russian weaponry seems to be that was revealed the other week, these nuclear-powered cruise missiles. Then these are there to take out hard targets.
Well, they're there to take out any target you like. I mean, let's face it, a nuclear bomb is not very discriminating. The point about chemical weapons is there's this whole trope of weapons of mass destruction. We all know the phrase weapons of mass destruction. Now, the reason that was pushed in the run-up to the First and Second Gulf Wars is because it blurs the line between nuclear weapons, which are nuclear, and conventional weapons. Chemical warfare is effectively just enhanced conventional warfare. You can kill quite a lot of people with chemical weapons, but not that many. They were found to be pretty useless in the First World War. They didn't work that well. And they're not comparable with nuclear weapons. They're just not. But by using the phrase weapons of mass destruction, you make them sound as if they are. And of course,
a chemical weapon could kill millions of people.
In theory.
Surely a bullet can't do that.
No, a nuclear weapon
also
can.
Biological weapons could effectively, I mean, if it was the right kind of thing, could kill the entire population of the planet.
I mean, I'm quite sure that the Iranians have still got a biological chemical warfare program because they haven't got nuclear
and biological weapons are much more indiscriminate. Anyway, also Israel has extensive stocks of chemical weapons, but has also always refused to declare any of them to the chemical weapons regulators. They're not a state party to the Chemical Weapons Convention, nor a member of the OPCW. So Israel signed in 1993, but refused to ratify, as this would mean inspection and destruction of the chemical weapons of Israel.
Well, I mean, if I was a Wiltshire police officer, I would suggest that the Israelis are one of the suspects in this case, because their policy in Syria has been completely frustrated by Putin and the Russians, and they've got a vested interest in stirring trouble between Britain and Russia. And of course, just think of it from take another step back. The Russians are just about to have a presidential election. In another universe, they would be congratulated for having the third relatively free election in their history after hundreds of years of authoritarianism. But instead of being congratulated, they're being vilified. And of course, Putin is going to win. He's going to win handsomely because he's got a lot of popular support.
I mean, they're saying that this is they're saying this is an attempt to interfere in the Russian elections.
Yes, I mean that's how it's perceived in Russia, because they know that Putin's going to win. Putin's going to win, which is very embarrassing for the West.
The death of Nikolai Glushkov as well, who was a friend of Boris Berezovsky. Now, we talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, let's go back to that here.
Glushkov was actually involved very much in working for Beresovsky at Aeroflot. Now, Aeroflot is absolutely key to understanding this competition between Putin and Berezovsky, because once Putin got into power, he thought he was going to be Berezovsky thought Putin was going to be his little puppet, would do what he wanted, but he revived this old Aeroflot case. Now, think about who these oligarchs are. Berezovsky was running the NTV channel, the biggest channel in Russia, private channel in Russia.
He was like a Berlusconi figure.
And also running Aeroflot. So this is where what was happening was the whole of the nation under Yeltsin, the drunken president, was being asset stripped. Berezovsky was one of the oligarchs that was doing that asset stripping. He was asset stripping the national airline. And once Putin got into power, he revived this old case and said, actually, Berezovsky, you've got some questions to answer about what happened to our national airline. And then Berezovsky had to flee the country and came to London. Now, this guy who's been found dead was someone that knew all about what had happened there.
Yeah, well, Berezovsky himself, of course, was found dead in his Surrey mansion some years ago, and the local coroner wouldn't write it, suggest it was a suicide.
It does make you wonder, doesn't it, if these people knew, or that they've been killed by someone that didn't want what they knew to come out to the public.
Yes, what you've got to remember is that these opposition figures to Putin, like this chap and Berezovsky...
Nikolai Glushkov, just remind you of his name.
And Khodorkovsky, who was sent to prison and then released. These people are big-style criminals. They're gangsters. And, the idea that Russia is an oligarchic state, in a sense, is true. But what Putin has done is he's disciplined the oligarchy, particularly the oligarchs of Jewish origin, many of whom have Israeli joint citizenship and are, were basically at one stage pulling Russia into Israel's orbit.
So the most, shall we say, draconian or ruthless element of the Russian mafia are in London, and some of them are actually funding the Conservative Party.
Well, and they're also opposed to Putin. Yeah, that's why they're in London. Beresovsky was getting more and more frustrated because, of course, he couldn't get the West to back him. He tried a sort of
a very close relationship with the Duke of Kent, didn't he?
Yes.
The Queen's cousin, who's also
now.
The
Don't
head
forget
of
that these people are quite capable of murdering each other in order to make Russia look bad. I know many people listening will say, "Well, that's a preposterous idea," but it's not. If you knew anything about Russia in the Bespredel era, as they called it, the without rules era, you will realise that all of these people are very, very gangsterish, and they're quite capable of killing each other over various disputes that they've got with each other.
It's handy in a way that this guy's no longer around, because it makes it more difficult to dig up all this stuff about what happened with the privatisation of Aeroflot, the asset stripping of Russia under Yeltsin.
Well, I mean, don't forget, this guy's 68 and he's died of a heart attack, so it's not necessarily the case that anybody murdered him at all. Berezovsky, on the other hand, was strangled. Now, they're saying that the police are now saying that there's evidence of compression on his neck. Okay, but that still doesn't mean the Russian state has done this. These people are gangsters. They've got enemies. And, of course, what may be happening here is we're having an intelligence. Don't forget, you've got to see this in the context of all the lies that have been told by the Western intelligence services about Russian policy over the last 5 years. The coup in Ukraine, where the shooters that shot the Maidan Square demonstrators, is just come out in a court case in Kiev. That was definitely not carried out by the then regime of Yanukovych. It was carried out by the new regime with mercenaries from Georgia who were actually given instructions by US military personnel, and that all came out in the court case in Kiev.
But of course, Ratsani was mentioning the coup in Ukraine actually on BBC Question Time last night, and getting sort of a lot of pilloried, as actually Jeremy Corbyn was. He was getting pilloried for questioning what the government are doing over this Russian Salisbury case.
Then you can see what the motivation is for Western intelligence services to carry out this scam. It puts Corbyn on the back foot. It means that we can ask for more money for military-industrial complex, 48 million more for Porton Down. It pulls Britain into line with Trump, and of course, I'm quite sure that will be the assessment of the Russian intelligence services of what's going on here. They will know whether they were involved or not. Think, why would the Russian intelligence services, when they're just about to have a successful national election in which Putin is going to win, come to Britain and kill somebody and make it look as if they did it so that they can get the blame? Okay, that's pretty silly, isn't it?
So what you're saying is a psychological warfare. Let's have a listen now to one of the initial statements by Theresa May about this whole business, and the reaction by former psychological warfare officer in the US Army, Scott Bennett.
It is now clear that Mr. Skripal and his daughter were poisoned with a military-grade nerve agent of a type developed by Russia. This is part of a group of nerve agents known as novichok. Based on the positive identification of this chemical agent by world-leading experts at the Defence Science and Technology Laboratory at Porton Down, our knowledge that Russia has previously produced this agent and would still be capable of doing so, Russia's record of conducting state-sponsored assassinations, and our assessment that Russia views some defectors as legitimate targets for assassinations, the government has concluded that it is highly likely that Russia was responsible for the act against Sergei and Yulia Skripal.
I think this was orchestrated by the UK government, possibly using other assets in CIA or Mossad, because Russia certainly doesn't gain from anything like this. And to summon the Russians and say, answer which of these two is correct, either you did this against us or someone else got your material and did this, the Russians need to say, no, there's a third option, and that is that the United Kingdom has designed a psychological operation to manipulate its own public, to distract the United Kingdom away from the MI6 Christopher Seal agent that wrote a false Russian dossier to undermine Donald Trump, and the British role in that, as well as the British role in the al-Nusra chemical weapons that has just come out, which Russia and Syria have said all along has nothing to do with Syria or Russia, but everything to do with the United Kingdom and the United States.
Now, what's he talking about there? Because I wasn't aware about this business of the British in some way being involved and the Americans maybe being involved in chemical weapons in Syria too.
Well, that's a very key point.
Al-Nusra.
The Al-Nusra front, Seymour Hersh, Scott Bennett's a former psychological warfare officer, but Seymour Hersh is a senior US journalist, if not the senior US journalist. He's got several Pulitzer Prizes and so on. He was the one who exposed the My Lai massacre. He wrote an article about the chemical weapons attack in Ghouta some years ago, which was blamed on the Assad government, and he pointed out that it wasn't only not the Assad government that carried it out, it was carried out by the Al-Nusra Front, which is Al-Qaeda, but that the sarin used for the attack came from Libya and had been supplied to Al-Nusra by Western intelligence services. So not only are the Russians not guilty in Syria, we are the guilty parties. And when Obama was saying there's a red line here if people use chemical weapons against their own people, or people in general, it's actually Western intelligence services who are the guilty party here. And the white helmets who have been the source of much of this scurrilous information are funded by the British taxpayer to the tune of millions of pounds. We've got people sleeping on the streets, but we've got people running around in Syria doing PR for Al-Qaeda as part of MI6. And as I said in the first hour, MI6 in places like the Middle East is not regarded as some kind of benevolent organisation. It's actually regarded as extremely tricky, ruthless and not very pleasant.
Lover or hater, Prime Minister Theresa May made a statement on Wednesday all about this. And this is about 4 minutes long, but we're going to have a listen now to what she had to say, and I'll ask you to comment afterwards, Martin, about the so-called Russian assassins of Salisbury.
There is no alternative conclusion other than that the Russian state was culpable for the attempted murder of Mr. Skripal and his daughter, and for threatening the lives of other British citizens in Salisbury, including Detective Sergeant Nick Bailey. This represents an unlawful use of force by the Russian state against the United Kingdom. And as I set out on Monday, it has taken place against the backdrop of a well-established pattern of Russian state aggression across Europe and beyond. It must therefore be met with a full and robust response, beyond the actions we have already taken since the murder of Mr. Litvinenko, and to counter this pattern of Russian aggression elsewhere. As the discussion in this House on Monday made clear, it is essential that we now come together with our allies to defend our security, to stand up for our values, and to send a clear message to those who would seek to undermine them. This morning I chaired a further meeting of the National Security Council, where we agreed immediate actions to dismantle the Russian espionage network in the UK, urgent work to develop new powers to tackle all forms of hostile state activity, and to ensure that those seeking to carry out such activity cannot enter the UK, and additional steps to suspend all planned high-level contacts between the United Kingdom and the Russian Federation. Let me start with the immediate actions. Mr. Speaker, the House will recall that following the murder of Mr. Litvinenko, the UK expelled 4 diplomats. Under the Vienna Convention, the United Kingdom will now expel 23 Russian diplomats who have been identified as undeclared intelligence officers. They have just 1 week to leave. This will be the single biggest expulsion for over 30 years, and it reflects the fact that this is not the first time that the Russian state has acted against our country. Through these expulsions, we will fundamentally degrade Russian intelligence capability in the UK for years to come. And if they seek to rebuild it, we will prevent them from doing so. Second, we will urgently develop proposals for new legislative powers to harden our defences against all forms of hostile state activity. This will include the addition of a targeted power to detain those suspected of hostile state activity at the UK border. This power is currently only permitted in relation to those suspected of terrorism. And I have asked the Home Secretary to consider whether there is a need for new counter-espionage powers to clamp down on the full spectrum of hostile activities of foreign agents in our country. Mr. Speaker, as I set out on Monday, we will also table a government amendment to the sanctions bill to strengthen our powers to impose sanctions in response to the violation of human rights. In doing so, we will play our part in an international effort to punish those responsible for the sorts of abuses suffered by Sergei Magnitsky. And I hope, as with all the measures I am setting out today, that this will command cross-party support. Mr. Speaker, we will also make full use of existing powers to enhance our efforts to monitor and track the intentions of those travelling to the UK who could be engaged in activity that threatens the security of the UK and of our allies. So we will increase checks on private flights, customs and freight. We will freeze Russian state assets wherever we have the evidence that they may be used to threaten the life or property of UK nationals or residents. And led by the National Crime Agency, we will continue to bring all the capabilities of UK law enforcement to bear against serious criminals and corrupt elites. There is no place for these people or their money in our country. Mr. Speaker, let me be clear. While our response must be robust, it must also remain true to our values as a liberal democracy that believes in the rule of law. Many Russians have made this country their home, abide by our laws, and make an important contribution to our country, which we must continue to welcome. But to those who seek to do us harm, my message is simple. You are not welcome here.
Unlike the Saudis, of course, of whom the red carpet will be rolled out.
Well, it was, wasn't it, last
Indeed,
week?
even though we know that various people were tortured to death by Mohammed bin Salman
and also
in the previous weeks before he arrived. Anyway, that's a bit of whataboutery.
But it isn't, because also we know that they are the main funders of Islamic extremism in Britain.
Indeed, that's right, because there was a government report that showed they were the main funders of extremist madrasas in the country, and therefore but we're not allowed to hear that because that would upset the government.
So one thing that strikes me about what she's saying there is these are very extreme measures for something which hasn't. It's a rush to judgment, it seems to me.
Well, yes. I mean, the point I would make about this is, where is the evidence that the Russian state was involved in?
Well, she'll say, we can't tell you because it's national security.
Well, I would say that that's not good enough, especially when we've got evidence going back decades of Western intelligence services engaging in this kind of provocation. And I'll mention him for the umpteenth time, Fernando Imposimato, the head of the Italian Supreme Court, who died last year. He uncovered the fact that the Western intelligence services were involved in terrorism, and including provocational terrorism, like kidnapping the Prime Minister and pretending that it was being done by the Red Brigades and then killing the Prime Minister. That was done by NATO intelligence services, by MI6. And if they can do that, they can kill a couple of people who are Russian nobodies who crossed the line in Salisbury, although they haven't died yet.
She also mentions Litvinenko there. How is that connected with
this? Well, the Litvinenko case, the Russians have always maintained that they didn't kill him as well.
Because he was a Russian agent, but he also wrote a book, didn't he?
Well, he wrote a book,
Blowing Up Russia.
He wrote a book called Blowing Up Russia, and of course in that book, which I'm quite sure Theresa May hasn't read, Litvinenko said that Putin and others that are running Russia are involved in the Moscow and Ryazan apartment bombs of 9/99, September 1999, when hundreds of people were killed by these no-warning bombs, supposedly by the Chechens, but in actual fact carried out by the FSB as a means of consolidating the power of Boris Yeltsin in his second term. When Putin was the Prime Minister. And of course, what's interesting about the books is Litvinenko says, I know this happened because I and my boss Beresovsky were involved in these bombings with Putin, and therefore Putin's guilty. And at the same time, these people were given asylum in Britain because they were used as a mechanism for getting back at Putin once Putin had double-crossed the CIA and MI6. But of course, all of these people are expendable. And when the police investigated the Litvinenko case, they found polonium everywhere. I mean, if you're going to kill somebody, I mean, Chavez was probably murdered by the US, but he died of very, very rare cancer.
It seems to me that Litvinenko,
which nobody could pin on them.
Litvinenko was simply the man who knew too much.
Yeah, that's right.
And the idea that he might actually start to talk about the possibility of who might have been, criticised Beresovsky, for example.
Yeah, I would suggest, as if I was a police officer investigating that, I would suggest that Beresovsky was the prime suspect. because he was getting desperate. And Beresovsky was pushing the idea that we've got to start using this against Putin. The Moscow bombs, we were involved in it. We know he was involved in it. Let's find one. And of course, the Western powers basically are saying to Beresovsky, we can't start accusing Putin of bombing Moscow.
That would bring the cat out of the bag.
Because that let the cat out of the bag for what we did at Bologna, what we did in 9/11 and all the rest of it.
And 7/7.
And 7/7. Basically, virtually all of these incidents are, in fact, intelligence service come-ons. But they're not by the Russian intelligence services, as I said on Russia Today the other week. The real scandal here is not that the Russians have been interfering in Western elections and trying to steer things. It's that the Western intelligence services are interfering. Look at the way this has played out. Within 24 hours, the whole raft of what the military-industrial complex wanted in the West has just been passed NEMCON on the back of an incident where it's not even been proved that there was any nerve agent. We've only got the government. They won't provide the nerve agent. It could be that the whole thing is just theatre. That's a possibility.
Okay, so let's have a listen to that wasn't all Theresa May had to say. There was some more measures that she talked about. This is a lot shorter, this bit, but I'm going to hear from you again after this, Martin.
Mr. Speaker, let me turn to our bilateral relationship. As I said on Monday, we have had a very simple approach to Russia: engage but beware. And I continue to believe it is not in our national interest to break off all dialogue between the United Kingdom and the Russian Federation. But in the aftermath of this appalling act against our country, this relationship cannot be the same. So we will suspend all planned high-level bilateral contacts between the United Kingdom and the Russian Federation. This includes revoking the invitation to Foreign Minister Lavrov to pay a reciprocal visit to the UK, and confirming there will be no attendance by ministers or indeed members of the royal family at this summer's World Cup in Russia. Finally, Mr. Speaker, we will deploy a range of tools from across the full breadth of our national security apparatus in order to counter the threats of hostile state activity. While I have set out some of these measures today, members on all sides will understand that there are some that cannot be shared publicly for reasons of national security. And of course, there are other measures we stand ready to deploy at any time, should we face further Russian provocation. Mr. Speaker, none of the actions we take are intended to damage legitimate activity or prevent contacts between our populations. We have no disagreement with the people of Russia, who have been responsible for so many great achievements throughout their history. Many of us looked at a post-Soviet Russia with hope. We wanted a better relationship. And it is tragic that President Putin has chosen to act in this way. But we will not tolerate the threat to life of British people and others on British soil from the Russian government, nor will we tolerate such a flagrant breach of Russia's international obligations.
Well, it's just sickening, really, to hear this hypocritical tirade.
So does she think, has she got definite evidence that it happened or not? Because she's saying both things. She's saying we think this that Putin was behind it, and then she's saying also that he definitely was behind it at the same time.
Well, in other words, they haven't basically got any evidence that they're prepared to share with us. So we're entitled to presume that they may be lying. And the idea that the British government doesn't lie about stuff like this, in Bologna where they were bombed, in West Belfast where they were bombed by the British, in Syria, where the chemical weapons attack was carried out with the aid and support of Western intelligence services, including our own, they would laugh a hollow laugh.
I mean, you can hear her turning the pages there. Who writes these speeches for us? She's just reading this off.
Yeah, they're written by the securocrats who run this country, and of course the securocrats who run this country. Dearlove, who used to head MI6, was quoted in the Telegraph or the Times the other week saying, "Well, Corbyn's unfit to be Prime Minister. He wouldn't pass a vetting." So somebody who used to be the head of our intelligence services presumes to decide who can and can't be Prime Minister, and that's because they have far too much power.
Anyway,
they've always had far too much power.
Anyway, let's have a listen now to Jeremy Corbyn, leader of the opposition Labour Party, his response to Theresa May's statement on this.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to thank the Prime Minister for advance sight of her statement and echo absolutely her words about the service of our emergency and public services. The attack in Salisbury was an appalling act of violence. Nerve agents are abominable if used in any war. It is utterly reckless to use them in a civilian environment. This attack in Britain has concerned our allies in the European Union, NATO and the UN, and their words of solidarity have strengthened our position diplomatically. Our response as a country must be guided by the rule of law, support for international agreements, and respect for human rights. So when it comes to the use of chemical weapons on British soil, it is essential that the government works with the United Nations to strengthen its chemical weapons monitoring system and involves the Office of the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. The Prime Minister said on Monday, either this was a direct act by the Russian state or the Russian government lost control of their potentially catastrophically damaging nerve agent and allowed it to get in the hands of others. Our response must be both decisive and proportionate and based on clear evidence. If the government believes that it is still a possibility that Russia negligently lost control of a military-grade nerve agent, what action is being taken through the OPCW with our allies? I welcome the fact the police are working with the OPCW. And has the Prime Minister taken the necessary steps under the Chemical Weapons Convention to make a formal request for evidence from the Russian government under Article 9.2? How has she responded to the Russian government's request for a sample of the agent used in the Salisbury attack to run its own tests? Has high-resolution trace analysis been run on a sample of the nerve agent, and has that revealed any evidence as to the location of its production or the identity of its perpetrators? And can the Prime Minister update the House on what conversations, if any, she has had with the Russian government? And while suspending planned high-level contacts, does the Prime Minister agree that it is essential to maintain a robust dialogue with Russia in the interest of our own and wider international security? With many countries, Mr. Speaker, speaking out alongside us, the circumstances demand that we build an international consensus to address the use of chemical weapons. We should urge our international allies to join us and call on Russia to reveal without delay full details of its chemical weapons programme to the Organisation for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. It is, as we on these benches have expressed before, a matter of huge regret that our country's diplomatic capacity has been stripped back with cuts of 25% in the last 5 years. It is, Mr. Speaker,
the right honourable gentleman must be heard. There will be adequate opportunity for colleagues on both sides of the House to put questions. Members must be heard. Jeremy Corbyn.
I couldn't understand a word of what the Foreign Secretary just said, Mr. Speaker, but his behaviour demeans his office. It is in moments such as these that governments realise how vital strong diplomacy and political pressure are for our security and national interest. The measures we take have to be effective, not just for the long-term security of our citizens, but to secure a world free of chemical weapons.
Now, the obvious question here is, these conventions, surely a sample of this should be sent either to the Chemical Weapons International Body or to the Russians. And the Russians can say, actually, we know where this came from or whatever.
Well, the Russians, that's exactly what the Russians said. There is a procedure to follow here. We're perfectly happy to cooperate because we don't want people being killed by this sort of... Don't forget that the Russians were adjudicated to have got rid of their chemical weapons stockpile under agreements that were made during the Yeltsin era, and they were given a certificate. There was actually a big party in Russia where they said we finally got rid of our chemical weapons. And don't forget, it was Putin who put pressure on Assad to get rid of his chemical weapons. Now it's possible that somewhere they're hiding some, but we're not hiding ours. We're actually expanding our chemical weapons facility at Porton Down. We're spending another 48 million quid on it, and of course, it does beg a belief.
Okay, well, a World Cup. She talked about that as well.
Well, I mean, one of my friends was suggesting that if these bigwigs don't want to go to the World Cup, we should have a lottery to have free tickets for those who do want to go.
Are we going to see ultimately a boycott of the World Cup?
Well, I mean, the Russians may turn around and say the only team that's not going to be allowed to come here is the English team, and you can suck on that.
But I mean, would that be a good?
No, I don't think they will do that. But they could.
That would just alienate the population.
Well, exactly.
Here,
and I think that if I was the Russians, I wouldn't even expel British diplomats at this stage. But the problem is that you've got public opinion in Russia. Public opinion in Russia is that they're being scapegoated. They feel that they never get a fair crack of the whip, and that everything they do is wrong. It doesn't matter how they behave. They're always going to be accused of, give a dog a bad name and they'll stick to it.
The most recent, I suppose, on this is the Defence Secretary yesterday here in Bristol, up at Rolls Royce, talking about this. That is to say, before he was an MP, he used to sell fireplaces. He's Gavin Williamson.
Yes. Oh.
What we will do is we will look at how Russia responds to what we have done. It is absolutely atrocious and outrageous what Russia did in Salisbury. We have responded to that. Frankly, Russia should go away, it should shut up. But if they do respond to the action that we've taken, we'll consider it carefully and we'll look at our options, but it would be wrong to prejudge their response. There is no doubt where this attack came from. It came from Russia. It is time for the whole country to unite behind the Prime Minister, give her our full support, make it clear as a nation that we stand together. That is what I believe when you sit in the House of Commons and you listen to members of Parliament from all parties on the backbenches. That is what they're wanting to see. Britain standing together against this great threat. That is what we will do. That is the support that we'll offer the Prime Minister. That is what the nation wants to see us doing from all parties.
Now, on Twitter, somebody described him as a sort of sinister version of Frank Spencer. But what he's saying there, this whole idea of go away and shut up, it doesn't sound like very diplomatic language.
Well, also, they're saying we think the Russians did it, but then that's elided into they definitely did do it. Now, in actual fact, it's not proven that they did. And, of course, they are saying we didn't do it.
What they're doing is conflating fact and speculation.
Yes. And, of course, they're also trying to bully people into line in Parliament. If you criticise us or whatever, then you're somehow a traitor or whatever. Now, the obvious thing for the Russians to do, if they really want to hurt us, is turn around to BP and say, right, you've got to get out of our oil fields. Just go.
And is that going to happen?
No. Because what the Russians want is actually, and I've said this on RT, I'm a regular contributor on RT, as you know, Tony.
They've also talked about revoking their licence.
Yeah, but because what they said to that is, well, we'll just revoke BBC licence inside Russia. Everybody can go down this tit-for-tat road, and it's not...
And is that likely to end in war?
Well, it could do. It could easily do, because basically the RAF are overflying Syria at the moment with drones run from RAF Waddington, and they're killing Russian military personnel.
Now, in the background to all of this, you've got to ask yourself, why would anyone want war? And it was fascinating speaking to Bruce Gagnon, and you can hear this on Dialect next Tuesday at noon here on BCFM. He's a campaigner against space weapons and nuclear power in space, and what he was explaining to me was that the real fear in the US military is that the Chinese and the Russians are catching up with the ability to destroy satellites in space. And so we're kind of back at the old Cuban Missile crisis stage in the 1960s, where we had the missile gap and that the Russians were catching up with the Americans. And so the military was saying, well, look, if we can have some sort of conflict now, we can actually deny space to the Chinese and to the Russians. But we need to do it now because they're catching up.
All right, well, there's quite a lot to unpack there. There wasn't a missile gap, in fact. It was a come-on by the military-industrial complex. The fact of the matter is there's mutually assured destruction is still there. That's what Putin's speech was about the other week. They've been pushing missiles into Romania and Poland, which are effectively first-strike missiles. When the Russians tried to do, when the Russians tried to do a similar thing in Cuba, they went nuts. But they're being asked to tolerate that being pushed in their faces. the Russians actually, before this incident, said that they had evidence that there was going to be another chemical weapons false flag inside eastern Ghouta, and that was going to be used as an excuse for a military strike by NATO powers on the Syrian military. And they said, don't do that because we will shoot your planes down. Now, without anybody wanting war, it could break out. And don't forget that Hilary Benn, who was a shadow foreign secretary at the time, he was pushing for us to go to war over the Ghouta chemical weapons attack, which Seymour Hersh, I think, pretty comprehensively shown was carried out by the Al-Nusra Front in league with White Helmets, who are all working for NATO intelligence. So in actual fact,
what about
there's
this
actually
idea
strong
of
evidence of NATO using chemical weapons as part of
what I'm
provocation.
talking about is this whole thing in space, because this is concerning. If the US military just this week have announced, Donald Trump has announced he wants a space force, which is like the Air Force in space, which I imagine is there to destroy Russian satellites and Chinese satellites.
Yeah, but the thing is, the Russians and the Chinese have known that they can't really compete in satellite technology with the West, so what they've got is things that shoot down satellites.
What about this new technology that Putin has announced, these nuclear-powered cruise missiles? What are they, a game changer?
They are a game changer, and that's another reason. The thing about the state-run arms industry in both China and Russia is that they decide what they want to produce and then they produce it. What you've got in the West is these various lobbies pushing for their stuff to be produced. So you've got all these people. The Porton Down people want chemical warfare. The Navy want more aircraft carriers, even though aircraft carriers are finished. Well, the Russians have concentrated on the important stuff: is if you attack us with any nuclear weapons or any of our allies. This is the important thing that Putin said. We will nuke you. And we won't just nuke you a bit, we will nuke you. We will kill you all if you attack us.
What's Theresa May's role in all this sort of rush to war?
She is basically a puppet of the intelligence services. She was a puppet of the intelligence services when she was Home Secretary. She's very much an insider in their games, and they tell her what to think, and that's what she thinks.
Now, I'm guessing around about 1973, that's Van Halen. I'll leave you to guess the title of that song. Now I think we'll finish with a chat with the son of the lawyer who was the lawyer for the American Jewish Boycott Committee of Nazi Germany, Anton Chaikin, and here he talks about the origins of Zionism. A lodge, a Masonic lodge, Quattro Coronati, that was also involved in the creation of Theosophy, the Golden Dawn, astrology, and the Tool Society, which led to the creation of Nazi Germany.
The first one who proposed that the Jews need to go back to Palestine was Lord Palmerston, the British foreign minister and later prime minister. In 1840, he sent a letter to the British ambassador in Turkey. Palestine at that time was part of the Turkish Empire, the Ottoman Empire. And Lord Palmerston said, the Jews as a nation desire to return to Palestine. And of course, as Abba Ibn pointed out, the Jews didn't know anything about that at the time. The British then sent troops a month later for the first time and landed them in Palestine. They didn't take it over at that time, but they started to get involved. Now, after the Civil War, the British set up a very strange organization called the Palestine Exploration Fund. It was set up by Queen Victoria and by the United Grand Lodge of Masons and other people supporting Masonic ideas. What do? They went to Palestine, which didn't belong to Britain, as part of the Turkish Empire, and they started to dig in the city of Jerusalem. Dig for ancient temples. Dig for any ruins that might be put to a certain use by the British Empire. You know, the Masons talk about restoring the Temple of Solomon, and this is what Meir Kahane and some of these crackpots of the extreme wing in Israel talk about. We got to restore the Temple of Solomon. And then your so-called fundamentalists over here will say, yes, once that's restored, then we can have our end of the world. Right? End times. Oh boy. Why do they want to restore Solomon's temple? That wasn't the last temple. There were 3 temples. The last time it got closed down was the 3rd temple, not Solomon. Solomon's was the 2nd. Why do they want to restore Solomon's temple? Because I think it might have to do with the fact that Solomon had more than God in his temple. He also had a few pagan gods in there, right? Read about that. Whatever it is, these guys from Britain went over there in the 1860s, 1870s, and dug way down. The leader of this, the head of the Palestine Exploration Fund, was a man named Sir Charles Warren, who wrote a book about his experience as the lead. He was an engineer in Her Majesty's Army. Wrote a book called Underground Jerusalem. Another book called The Temple or the Tomb. And he published a book in the 1870s proposing the colonization of that section of the Ottoman Empire that the British called Palestine in exchange for taking over Turkey's national debt. Right? And he said, let this be done with the avowed intention of gradually introducing the Jew, pure and simple, who is eventually to occupy and govern this country. It is written over and over again in the Word of God. Israel are to return to their own land. It's a British Army guy saying this, right? Okay, so now, who is this fellow? This is Charles Warren. He goes back to England. He takes a few trips to South Africa, spends a number of years killing the natives down there and shooting some of the Dutch people. And then he goes back in 1886 to London, and he starts a new Masonic organization, and it's called the Quattro Coronati Lodge. Now let's write this down for you specialists in the audience. Quattro Coronati means the 4 crowned ones. This is a research lodge of the Freemasons, the British Freemasons. By the way, when I say Freemason, I mean British Freemasons, because as of this point in time in the world today, there's nothing but British Freemasonry. On the whole planet, with a minor exception in France, don't say Freemasonry, say British Freemason, okay? It's British. Anyway, this is a special lodge they set up. This guy was the head of it. He had another job at the same time. He was police commissioner in London. And it just happened at that time that the royal family had a little problem. The grandson of the Queen married the wrong person, see? And they wanted to cover that up, and she was hustled off to an insane asylum, and all the witnesses were killed. Cut up with Masonic signs all over them. And they said, oh, it's a lone assassin named Jack the Ripper. It was nice to have a police commissioner who was also the head of this lodge, Quattuor Coronati. Also, they had the assistant coroner who's in the same little group. And he lost his job because there was a big uproar about that, but so what? He helped the royal family out, you know. This lodge went on to do very interesting things. They produced some new groups in the world. One group that they controlled was called the Theosophists. Another group that they controlled was called astrology. Astrology had been ended in Europe, possibly hundreds of years before. There was some little bits of astrology that would float through France, etc., but at least for 100 years, or much more than that, it was dead in France and Germany. And in the 1890s, the British reintroduced it into Germany and France. Why would they do that? Geopolitics. And these guys write about how they did it and how proud they are of introducing superstition into Europe. There was a group called the Order, capital O, Order of the Golden Dawn, that was organized by this little group in England, this research lodge, who are the founders and promoters of Zionism also, right, in the sense of having actually undertaken this as a project. This group was later run by Aleister Crowley, who's a pretty famous Satanist who came to Hollywood and helped start Hollywood early in this century. These guys were running Freemasonic and various occultist things in Turkey to shake things up in Turkey and prepare the way for the Messiah? I doubt it. Right? Prepare the way for British geopolitical games and to control the route to India and so forth. Right? It's a very strategic area, Israel, right? Palestine. Right between Europe, Asia, and Africa. So they had in Turkey all of these crazy false Muslim groups based on the Sufi tradition, run by the British. The B'nai B'rith was there in great depth, run by the British. There was a guy who went down there to Turkey from Germany and became involved with these British organizations, became a Turkish Freemason there and astrologer named Sabatendorf. I don't know if I spelled it correctly, but he became famous later. He went back to Germany and founded another sub-order of this thing called the Tula Society, which is the people who taught Adolf Hitler about the occult. All run by the British. Houston Stewart Chamberlain was there living in southern Germany.
Time to sign off for the Murdoch News at 8. Here's wishing you a relaxing and enjoyable BCFM weekend. Do please join us for the Politics Show next week. We're online at thisweek.org.uk. God bless, and don't let the banksters get you down.
Online and on your mobile. BCFM is an award-winning community radio station for Bristol, bringing you national news on the hour. Live from the Sky News Centre.